In the 7 or 8 years since it was composed, Eden has developed a bit of a reputation as being such a complicated piece of music that it's very difficult to comprehend, and some performers are maybe put off from doing so. This short video attempts to offer some performance tips for John Pickard's Eden.
So one of the main difficulties of being a composer is how you actually notate what you do. When I teach composition, 90% of the time I spend with my students, we're dealing with notational issues in some sort of way, because our notation system is okay as far as it goes, but when you want it to go further, you have to start thinking in a slightly different way. Now, what I was trying to achieve in the opening section of Eden was freedom. It's what the music is about, flexibility. And so there are certain things that are happening in here which try to achieve that freedom, which will not be the same from one performance to another. Often in the solo parts there is notational freedom with what have now become known as feathered beams. So for example, on page 10 of the score you see in the solo euphonium and solo cornet parts that there are feathered beams, but that's just for one player. The player gets slightly faster as they play the phrase. What I then did at passages like letter E on page 11 is to take this idea further and to transfer that freedom to the entire band. Now there is a paradox here, because I've got a single feathered beam for almost the entire band. So they speed up and slow down in a flexible kind of way, and yet they've got to do it in unison.
One of the challenges in performance is to achieve this free and liberated effect that John was after. And the way I solved this was to look at those long streams of notes and actually divide them into pairs. I could easily do this when there was an even number of notes. Occasionally there was an odd number of notes where I've needed a little bit of artistic license, but essentially that was the routine. Divide into pairs, so each of the notes is half a beat each. Then I carried on conducting a gradual acceleration and a gradual rallentando through the passage, which I hope would give this liberated feel we were after.
What I'm doing here is asking the question, well, what is, in musical terms, what is freedom? The irrational time signatures are something that you find in quite a bit of contemporary concert music these days. Not a great deal, but some composers use them. And they are a way of achieving greater rhythmic flexibility. And in most of the cases where I use them here, for example at letter I on page 19, what the irrational time signatures are doing is keeping a pulse going. So if you look at the bass drum part at bar 64, the bass drum is playing in quintuplets in the first bar and continues doing that 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5, and then the next bar there are just 3 of them, so it is a quintuplet beat but just 3. And there would be an enormously complicated way of notating that involving metric modulations, which would look far more confusing on the page than simply to write a 3/10 time signature here. So partly, even though it seems like a very new sort of thing to do for brass bands, it is ultimately quite an elegant sort of solution, and it actually makes the notation simpler once you've explained to the players what is actually needed.
So the thing we had to remember when performing this part of the piece was the fact that any time signature with a 10 as the bottom number meant that the quavers in this time signature equated to the quintuplet quavers of the previous time signature. So for example, 2 bars before letter I, the cornet and the trombone are playing a passage. Here the time signature has 4 crotchets in the bar, but over the last 2 crotchets they have quintuplet quavers. This moves into a 4/10 bar, the bar before I, where those 4 quavers carry on at the same rate as the quintuplet quavers from the previous bar. We also had to remember that any time signature with a 12 at the bottom meant that quavers in that time signature equated to a group of 6 quavers from the previous time signature. So for example, in the 3rd bar of letter I, the timpani play this sextuplet at the end of the bar. This moves into a 7/12 bar, and the speed of the quavers in this bar is exactly the same speed as the quavers were in the sextuplet at the end of the previous bar.
Although most of the time I've no desire to make the players' lives more complicated than they need to be, really genuinely I don't want to do that, there is just one moment where I deliberately introduced an awkwardness. I have to own up to it, and that's on page 20, bars 72 and 73, because at that point you have to get from a 5/12 into a 4/10. For the rest of the metric modulations, you're going from a simple time signature into one of the irrational ones. Here you have 2 irrational time signatures that rub up against each other, and there is no way of cheating. You see, before that you could rebar things in different ways, which I think ultimately it's actually self-defeating. I think it just makes it more complicated. But here you can't really do that. The bands just have to feel the difference between 5/12 and 4/10, and that can only be done by practice, and I deliberately put that in to avoid cheating.
So one of the most difficult passages is between bar 70 and letter J. At bar 70 the time signature has 4 crotchets in the bar, and at the end of the bar is the familiar sextuplet. This moves into an 11/12 bar, where you have 11 quavers at the same rate that they were being played through that sextuplet, and this is in turn followed by a 5/12 bar, again 5 quavers at that same rate. The difficulty is going from bar 72 to 73, where the time signature changes to 4/10. In other words, the quaver speed changes to a rate which is equivalent to groups of 5 from the previous tempo. In other words, you have the rate of groups of 6 quavers butting up with the rate of groups of 5 quavers. Essentially, we were looking for the quavers to slow down over that bar line. 1, 2, 3,